Hello and a very warm welcome to Moneycontrol. As election season picks up, clearly the fight for votes is becoming a fight for freebies. My freebie is bigger than yours. My dole will have a greater impact than yours. That's the narrative of politics that's playing out in the country. Front page ads in newspapers across the country on free gas cylinders, free electricity and whatnot. But there are no free lunches. To understand that in greater detail, we have with us member of the Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council, Dr. Shamika Ravi, an eminent economist and a big believer in the India story. Dr. Ravi, thank you so much for joining us. I have to begin by asking you, in the last few months, we've seen this whole rhetoric around freebies just take very high decibel levels, whether it's elections in Karnataka, whether it's Rajasthan. Politicians are going back in their politics when they come back, when they're coming out and offering these freebies. What is the impact that you see of these announcements on the economy and on the narrative? And, what does it mean for the electorate?
Well, as you mentioned in the opening remarks, there are no free lunches, which means that when states promise, either they're going to renege, and by the way, we are seeing some of that happen, or if they do implement some of these policies, then it's really going to come out of longer term growth. Now, remember, for a country with $2,200 per capita income, we are a low middle income country. We still have a long way to go as far as the aspirations are concerned.
Right.
For us to then take away money from development funds, or long-term, let's say, infrastructure building, or social or economic development, and to give away in the form of freebies today for short-term political gains, I think that will be hugely regressive, and I think it's unfair to the future generations.
So, if you look at the state of Rajasthan,
Right.
There are a lot of incentives, a lot of freebies or doles that are being offered. In Karnataka, we saw, and the Congress party won the election in Karnataka, and there is a lot of talk right now about whether they are able to afford those freebies.
Right.
In terms of the fiscal impact on states, we talk about it like it will happen in some time in the near future. It will not impact our lives. Going back to the old pension scheme will not impact our lives currently, and we're taking a very short-term view. Any analysis or any findings that you can share with us on, how do these freebies play out on ground after they're offered, after the state has paid for it? Any historical context to this that that can help us understand this better?
I think, Shweta, the most compelling story is one of Punjab, which is not historic, it's very recent, and it has happened in the last 25 years. That if we are going to be populist in our policies, electorally wanting to appease one segment, there is a cross-subsidization, there is a cost that the other section has to bear. And in the case of Punjab, we saw very clearly that giving free electricity, free resources to farmers, was only going to be feasible within the state if you actually charged higher to industry.
Right.
Which is what the state did. And what was the outcome of that?
Yeah.
In a large, competitive federal structure like India, Punjab is our state which has seen a very rapid deindustrialization.
Correct.
So when you're going to make it very difficult for industry to do business, survive, they will just move away. And most of them are local entrepreneurs. And they have moved away where? They didn't go to Vietnam or, right? They went to Himachal, they went to Haryana, they went to Rajasthan. So in this kind of a setup, it's, the state eventually pays a price. Because remember, even in the case of Punjab, the cross-subsidization or rapid deindustrialization meant fewer jobs, lesser growth, and eventually less money, not just, to the state, but eventually less money for development and growth, ordinary people.
Right.
So the state does suffer, and we have seen, it's a very stark example, and it's very recent for us to forget.
So, in terms of, I'll talk about Rajasthan because it's an election year. We did an analysis to understand what the impact is going to be, and fiscally, anyways, the state is in a precarious situation. So I'd like you to zoom out a little bit and tell us, what states are sitting on a debt time bomb that can explode anytime, and Can they afford to go this route for a very long time?
So we have to look at the state spending. There are two broad buckets. There is the development part of it, and then there's the non-development part of it. In the non-development part of the state spending, the big buckets are pensions, interest payments. Administrative expenditures is a small part of it, but a significant part of it nonetheless. And if we deal with each of these three non-development expenditures, the last 30-year trend is very clear. We see that, in the first 10 years of liberalization, in the 90s, states were seeing a rapid escalation of pension payments. Right. Every state in the country saw a rapid escalation of the pension payments as a percentage of the total development spending. But after the reforms were brought in, when the pension reforms happened, the new pension reform, you see every state that eventually implemented it, which everyone did, you see that's stabilized. Pension expenditure continued to grow because the population is growing, aging and so on, but it's stabilized as a percentage of development spending. Now we are going back on it. Right? State after state, when you see Punjab has gone back, Himachal has gone back. Pension as a development spending for these guys are almost 30-35%. These are very large numbers.
Yeah.
Where is the money going to come from? The money has to come from development spending.
Right. And they cannot rely on the center.
Well, clearly not. Right? Because most of that burden is borne internally.
Right.
The center does the same. I mean, there is a share from the center. There are grants from the center, but a major part of that expense will come from development spending. And that is what the data shows very clearly, that the trade-off is in terms of the development spending of the state. So the more you promise in terms of pensions, the more you put into debt interest payments, the less you will have for development spending,
right?
Whether it is social development or economic development.
So with a lot of states going back to the old pension scheme, by when do you think there was an assessment that it could be in the next? So our children, for instance, will pay the price for it.
Right.
So the payouts will come at about after 20 years or 30 years. Is that a reasonable time frame, or could it happen sooner?
You see, those are very simplistic assessments, Shweta. Let me tell you that when the state cuts down on development spending because it has to spend more on pension, it means, what does it mean forget children, what does it mean for all of us right now?
Right.
Poorer healthcare, it means poorer quality and fewer in number of schools. It means infrastructure falling behind. It means our day-to-day functioning.
Right.
Everything that the state provides in the name of development will get cut down. And by the way, we have seen in some of our states which have tremendous debt burden, and I would like to, I think Kerala is one that stands out. It's done splendidly in development over the last 70 years, but I think the debt burden of the state has led to the infrastructure today which is not keeping up with the rest of the country. Right? So development trade-off is quality of life for people today.
Right.
We don't even have to wait 20 years to see the impact of it.
Absolutely. So according to you, according to your analysis, what are the worst performers when it comes to, trading development for such schemes?
Right.
And which states have done well, according to you, in terms of balancing between development and welfare?
Now, in terms of, if we look at states that have managed their affairs, and by affairs I mean just the way they have administered themselves. So if you look at administrative expenditures as a percentage of, let's say, the total development spending of the state, then two states that stand out with the least amount of spending or the most efficient spending, therefore, it's not least amount, it's least to the as a ratio of the total development spending, then Gujarat and Karnataka stand out from the rest in very stark ways, because they have actually lowered their administrative expenditure to development spending. And what does that mean? In plain English, it means more efficient and effective governance, right? Administration. So as a percentage of overall development spending, the share that is going now into the maintenance of the state and the running of the administration has been coming down. And this in reality is what, small government, maximum governance is about, right? Of course, we also have some states which are not only growing slowly, but their administrative burden as as a percentage of the development spending is actually rising over time.
Okay, such as?
We have some in the Northeast. Meghalaya stands out, and this is a concern. This kind of trend where states are spending a lot more in the running and the administration over time. And I'm talking about last 30 years. So I'm not talking about a few years here and there.
Sure.
These long-term trends, I think, are disturbing. Then, in terms of pension payments as a percentage of the development spending, for high-growth states, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, etc., do stand out because their pension burden to development spending is significant. Much, much higher than all India averages, right? So they are devoting a considerable amount and an unsustainable amount, because this is not sustainable. The kind of pension to development burden that these states have, it's not viable. Similarly, Punjab. If you look at the impact of that, meaning how much are they really spending on long-term capital outlays? What are the capital outlays? Which is a good proxy for longer-term growth of these states.
Yeah.
West Bengal, Punjab, these states are actually, they are spending lesser and lesser
on capital outlays.
But
more on running of the government.
More on everything else, right? Freebies in the form of more pension, reverting the pension reforms and going back to the old pension scheme, greater debt burden. I mean, the overall management, the management of the state, of their financial affairs is hugely problematic from a longer term growth perspective. So people in these states, I think we need to talk more about it. We need to talk exactly about what is the cost of these freebies. It's not free.
Absolutely. So, I want to ask you, when you do talk to leaders from these states, they will tell you that look at Kerala's human development indicators. They're very high, much better than a lot of other states in the country. So how do you, what is that fine line that divides a freebie and a welfare? How does, can there be a one-size-fits-all approach? Because every state will have their own requirements and they might gauge that, okay, I need to do this for my people. So, what is the, how do you differentiate between when are you overspending and what is necessary spending?
Well, eventually in a democracy, I think people elect governments which respond to their preferences. Now, for our stage of development and economic growth, economic growth it's non-negotiable.
Of course.
No state in the country today can say that now we have reached a level of well-being and affluence where we don't have to grow anymore, or we can lower down on the growth. Nobody, including Kerala. So I think, or I should say including Gujarat, right? Because Gujarat has seen a 300% increase in per capita income in the last 30 years, right? Major gain. But long way still to go.
Yeah, when you go to Gujarat, you feel like the issues of that state are completely different from other states. The roads are fantastic. People are talking about entrepreneurship, this whole thing about jobs. The narrative is very different in that state.
No, so the growth mindset, I think eventually in a democracy, people will get the government that they elect.
Right.
But at the same time, the governments that they elect have to respond to their economic preferences and longer term well-being, the aspirations of the people. Now, the interesting thing about Kerala example, and by the way, I grew up there. For me, it's my home. The development dividend in terms of the outcomes in health, education, etc., that the state enjoys has been on account of historic cultural movements, right? Traditionally, last 100 years, or perhaps if you go back 100 years, there have been great focus on women's health and education, and the dividends are for people of Kerala to enjoy for many, many decades since. The issue is, why does Kerala continue to have unemployment rate which is twice that of all India?
Yeah.
And these two things coexist, by the way, right? High development in terms of great literacy, great health outcome, education outcome, very, very high unemployment. You have to balance these two things out, because aspirations, not having jobs, eventually also means,
and people move out of that state a lot.
People move out, yes. It's a state that depends on remittances a great deal. But it's a state which despite very good health indicators, also has lots of mental health issues. It's a state which has very high suicide rates. So every state has its unique problems.
Right.
And solving those problems requires money. It requires good governance, which keeps into account people's expectations. And that's why I'm saying that having very high debt today, or very high pension burden today, or spending too much on running of affairs of the state, all of these non-development expenditures have a cost. And that cost is development, future development, and having the money to spend on all these things, which people deserve.
So, I want to talk to you about the maximum governance, minimum government point, right? That was the promise of the Prime Minister as well. But at the moment, we see that the government is in every aspect, from handing out the employment letters to, a slowing disinvestment pipeline and so on. How difficult is it for the government to withdraw from certain sectors? You have been part of, you've seen government work, government working up close now, and you're part of that whole process. So while there's a vision, but the implementation is a challenge, what are the key challenges in that?
I often say that now India has provided a new model for welfare. We can talk about world development, and this is the whole leveraging the digitalization. Welfare has become more efficient. This is this whole DBT, which you're hearing IMF call, it's a logistic marvel. People say this is, great words of praise coming from all quarters as far as that part of the government is concerned, which is running of government.
Sure.
When you're talking about disinvestment, when you're talking about trying to get the government out of many businesses, the intent is very clear, and in that sense, you are seeing budget after budget reaffirm that intent.
Right.
The actual execution of it is obviously far more complex, right? And it's complex because we have to work within the institutional framework, which includes, by the way, jobs is one part of that.
Sure.
And in a democracy, you have to be sensitive to what is the public sector promising over and beyond. I mean, there's a theory of the public sector, and today, of course, after China's performance and experience, there is a greater degree of belief that perhaps state enterprises can be made more efficient and can be made more entrepreneurial in some sense. So there is also a pushback from that quarter, remember.
Okay.
The third side of it is purely economic, in the form that the kind of scale that you need enterprises to attain in order to compete at the global level, you want to maintain some of your government enterprises.
Okay.
Because you are seeking global competitiveness, and you're seeking that kind of technology transfers, which will eventually, make these enterprises run well, and it's good for everyone. So there are competing beliefs and evidences, and we have to work within the institutional framework. So what we say disinvestment, and we need to disinvest this. Sometimes you're seeing in the banking sector, for instance, consolidation happen.
Right.
That's one way of basically just, divesting away from many entities into having to then manage one large, hopefully better run entities. But it's a slower process on account of the institutional framework that democracy basically affords. And so we have to work within that setup. But the intent and the push, you see that year on year. I think the government is very clear that we do want to finance our long-term growth.
Sure.
By pulling out of a lot of these state enterprises, which have proven to be inefficient.
Sure. So this is a pre-election year, and the rhetoric around freebies or doles or whatever you might want to call it, welfare, has gone up. Does it worry you that the government might go down that path? And what are the priorities for the government in this year?
I think as this government has shown also in the last couple of years that we have had state elections, and the pundits who are closely following have often predicted that it'll give way to populist movements, and we have seen that has not happened, including this year's budget.
Sure.
Right? So the elections are all, everyone knows, perfectly predetermined, exactly when they're going to happen. And yet the annual budget in no way had any populist tendencies. And I'll tell you, Shweta, that's on account of the fact that you can't take your eyes off the ball, which is a long-term growth.
Right.
I think the country's aspirations, which is this whole Amrit Kal, the whole idea of Amrit Kal is that we want to be a developed country in the next 25 years. And it's not going to be leapfrogging. We will really have to do this year on year on year.
Absolutely.
And we are going to see state elections. Every year we have state elections, but that doesn't mean that you get the eyes off the ball. So in many ways, I'm very proud of, the kind of stand the government took in terms of the announcement of the annual budget. At the state level, however, you will. I mean, it's a democracy, and you have to garner faith, and you have to give compelling reasons to people for why they must continue to vote for you. From all the surveys that have been conducted, you see that Prime Minister Modi continues to enjoy a great degree of faith and popularity amongst people.
Right.
Partly you can understand that, if you look at the data, the NFHS data, which we did, about 12 lakh households, the poorest segment, which is the most marginalized segment of the population, without any form of discrimination, you are seeing across social groups, across religious groups, across geographies, access to amenities are reaching near universalization, right? Which we often say saturation, that every citizen must have access to every basic amenities everywhere. You heard the PM talk about this repeatedly.
Yeah.
But what does it mean? And the numbers are showing that, and these are self-reported numbers. I'm not quoting government numbers, administration numbers. No. These are self-reported survey numbers, and it's telling you, Dekho, there is politics. There will be elections, and then there is administration.
So inclusive growth is something.
Inclusive growth and equitable welfare and equitable growth. I think people recognize, but we have to keep, measuring and keep talking about it and showing the evidence and reaffirming that faith. That is an ongoing exercise, and it will continue to be so.
Okay, we're just nearing the end to our conversation. I want to talk to you about Ayushman Bharat.
Right.
There is a sense that Ayushman Bharat could be expanded. Any specific states that have done well in the implementation of Ayushman Bharat, and what can we expect in the expansion of the scheme?
So, universalization of health insurance or publicly financed health insurance is one way to really manage the cross-subsidization. Remember, health insurance as an instrument works much better if it is spread over a larger population.
Sure.
Right? So, the risks are offset. So theoretically, there is good reason to then defragment the market, because the bottom 40% have Ayushman today. If you look at the top few percentages that are employed in the government, which varies across states, etc., they do have government insurance at the highest level.
Right.
Rest, we have ESIS. Then of course there is a private sector which is there, but even the publicly financed health insurance part of it is fragmented. So the idea of defragmenting and sort of expanding Ayushman to cover a larger segment is a good idea, theoretically, right? I think when you ask about what is the impact of it,
right,
that is when now we have to start looking at the data from the last 4 years and see. Now you have to also define what is an impact, what is a good impact, right? Well, very clearly what we have seen in India historically, that the out-of-pocket health expenditure, which is a measure of saying that if India spends 1 rupee on healthcare, how many paisas come out of private pockets? That has reduced from 67% to now 48%, which is a major decline.
In the last 4-5 years?
In the last 5 years, right?
So
that kind of a decline reaffirms again the fact that having this kind of publicly financed health insurance and having access to Ayushman is lowering the health burden financially on the people. But we have a long way to go because at the end of the day, it is a financial instrument.
Of course.
Yeah. It buys healthcare for you. The healthcare that is available locally will eventually, and the quality of it will determine how well we are performing. And so we go back to then talking about improving the public health system. right? Improving our public health infrastructure. So the government hospitals have to be improved. Our primary health centers have to be strengthened. And that is again where we go back to the second aspect of the Ayushman, which was, the wellness centers.
Sure.
And the wellness centers, are the first gate or the first point of contact between a citizen and the public health infrastructure. So strengthening that will obviously mean making Ayushman sustainable in the long run. And that continues to be an endeavor where it's not going to be a short-term measure. It will take time because it requires human resources.
Right.
It requires, so it's more than finance then.
Of course.
We need high quality, we need people in the rural areas, in the remote areas.
Any specific states that have done a better job of implementing Ayushman?
Implementation right now, Shweta, are being seen from the point of view of eventually how many people have access to the cards.
Right.
And barring some of the states, unfortunately, that are opposition states, the rest of the states have done pretty well, in fact, significantly well in terms of handing out cards and empaneling private hospitals, because not everywhere do you have good quality public health. So it's a pity. But, the states which did not sign in, and West Bengal always stands out as an odd example. But people eventually pay a price for it, where the neighboring states, the poor, bottom 40%, they have access to, or at least the financing side of things, and people in Bengal don't. So I would say that as states that stand out, as sort of missing out, I think West Bengal definitely does stand out.
So there has been a lot of talk about cooperative federalism, how that'll determine the future. It'll play a big role in powering the India growth story. But in the last few years, we do see that that's taken a hit. How does it play out on ground? Like, for instance, you just shared with us that a lot of states, opposition ruled states, did not opt for Ayushman Bharat, which means people living in those states are relying on some state-run scheme or whatever that might be. What is the impact on development? And do you see that, the friction between states probably has become a little more aggravated, and leaders need to rise above petty politics, as it were?
I think you're absolutely right. How does it play out? Well, when a person in Bengal falls sick, they go to the local hospitals. And if the treatment is not, by the way, this could be Bengal or Bihar, if they are not treated appropriately, then they come to Delhi. They go to, states where you do have healthcare more in abundance. In which case, not having Ayushman for that person also means then not having, this whole move where the idea is to have one UHID, to have this completely defragmented, this whole duplication where everywhere you need to do the tests again, the whole concept of Digi Health Locker where the tests done in one place work through the chain of, the treatment. No, people have to pay a price at the end of it when you're not part of this larger sort of universal scheme. The ones who suffer are the ones who are left out of it for whatever political short-term objectives. So I think that is one example.
Right.
I think what is now concerning is in terms of states going back on what were clearly some of the most fundamental and very significant reform that the country did, which is in the form of the pension scheme. And the new pension scheme, the data is so clear, it's so obvious that before the reforms, every state was seeing an escalation in cost. And after the reform, you saw that the costs for pensions did stabilize. Now, to go back on that means they are going to face escalation in costs, right? And that money will come out of development spending, which means access to health, quality education, infrastructure, irrigation, all those things will suffer because now we are basically, the states are cowing down for political reasons to a very small subset of people who are well organized. Because development spending, when you talk about public health, public education, irrigation, and so on, it's not for the most affluent 5 or 10%, which are working in the government and which will benefit from the pensions, right? So I think that messaging has to go out loud and clear, that the small handful of well-organized people are basically going to gain at the expense of the masses.
Moving on from the state economies to the India growth story, in the year going ahead, what are the key challenges that you see? Do you think that the global uncertainty will have an impact on India? How much of a threat or a worry is the Russia-Ukraine war? Do you see that playing out for India? And what are the things that, according to you, are working for India?
I think what's working for India, Shweta, right? What did work even through the pandemic? What has worked even through the Ukraine-Russia, the war? What has worked through the US-China trade war has been through all of this turmoil and uncertainty at the global level. I think what has been working is right from the top, having clarity of the longer term objective. We have to grow. We have to do what is best for us. We have to keep the eyes on this 25-year agenda, which is that we will continue to grow. We will do what it takes in terms of internally strengthening welfare, internally strengthening policies, reforming. We have had some of the most major reforms in the last 2-3 years. They have not caught the eyeballs, and unfortunately we haven't talked a great deal about them, but simpler things, digitization of land records, if you think of property cards, lots of such reforms, and a continuum of reforms have been happening. Largely on account of the fact that the global turmoil will happen, but our internal reforms, what are absolutely required for the next phase of prolonged exponential growth, that we cannot slack off on. And I think just keeping policies pragmatic, having clear vision, and I do think it has come all the way from the top, that continuing to have very clear strategy in terms of what we want and what is it that we are looking for across ministries. You're seeing a convergence, which for a large country, a complex country, a large federal country, not an easy thing, because even for us, we are seeing that there is a remarkable shift in the way governance is being managed, and strategies are emerging as clear Indian strategy. For us to be able to also talk about it lucidly in terms of what is it that we want. That kind of clarity helps the purpose. And we are seeing that even within the G20, the presidency, country after country, this marveling the DBT, and many countries wanting to emulate, wanting help at different levels to be able to implement this in their own. That's why I say that the Indian model of welfare, I think is going to emerge as a new sort of a world development. It's a welfare model for many developing countries and underdeveloped countries.
To ensure that the money or the welfare reaches the last person.
That digitalize the process, cut out the middlemen.
Cut out the middlemen, And
because we're all countries which don't have abundant resources. So that kind of leakage is hugely damaging, right? So I do understand why so many countries are interested in emulating the Indian experience. And I think these are the kind of gains that we should be tremendously proud of. While again, working on the fact that how do we continue to grow at 7, hopefully push it further, and the kind of reforms that are required for, moving into a developed phase. So yes, we are a large federal country. We do have differences in politics, but in a democracy, the best bet is that we continue to talk about it and show evidence that we have made these gains. We have a long way still to go on some counts, but the short-term politics, I think, should definitely refrain, in terms of pulling some states back. And I think, when some states are pulled back, the country gets pulled back.
Yeah, of course.
But you do see that in the bottom 20%, that kind of the popularity the PM enjoys is on account of the fact that, the marginalized and the poorest are gaining tremendously. They're gaining tremendously through this new welfare model. And they reciprocate.
So do you see this short-term politics being a bigger drag on India than the global environment right now? Do you think we've decoupled ourselves, say, from the US economy considerably, and whatever issues or challenges that we face are domestically, are largely domestic?
The Indian voter is actually quite smart. So I don't, we shouldn't be reading too much into one state election or another. People in general are smart, and they know what they want. And I have that kind of faith. I'm seeing that repeatedly. If you look at the data, that people do reward performance. People like the idea of, if you see the aspirations, expectations today are, of young India are enormous, and they match the OECD countries today. So whether you look at the startup space, there's an entire other segment to the economy as well,
absolutely, which
is racing ahead, and I think I'm hugely optimistic on that count, that the domestic politics, we do need to work on how we come together, perhaps set certain institutions where the good practices and how efficient administration from one state can be learnt and implemented in other states. So that kind of learning mechanism we need to strengthen. We definitely need to strengthen trust across. But eventually it's up to the people, and the more educated people are, and the more you guys do your job and take the the message and across. I don't think the international turmoil of any form or changes, I don't think they are as big a threat ever, especially if you have clarity in terms of where do you want to be in the next 25 years.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Ravi. We do hope that people choose well, and we do hope that cooperative federalism comes back once again and India collectively moves ahead. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.